Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to another aesthetic imaging video tutorial. Something I want to bring up before we get started right at the front of this episode here is that in April, I will be changing the name of the channel to AIP Tutorials because aesthetic imaging video tutorials is a bit of a mouthful. So yeah, all of March I'll be announcing that it's going to change, and in April it will become AIP Tutorials. Let's get started. Alright, so if you saw the last one, we know that we went over all the different parameters and settings of the curves effect, and we went over color correction, we went over using the transparency to make that blobby effect, and we also used curves to isolate certain values within a texture image to create a more interesting abstract background. So this episode we're going to be doing even more stuff. As usual, the project files will be available to download. I'll leave a link in the description to where you can download them and follow right along. Alright, so in this first example, we're going to be creating a contrast curve, which is a pretty simple concept, but something that should be covered because it gets used a lot. Alright, so what we're going to do is down in here, in this empty space, we're going to right click, go to New, Adjustment Layer. I mean, you know all this by now. And we're going to call this adjustment layer Contrast Curve. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to add our curves effect. I'm sure by now you know it's under effects and presets and color correction and then curves. So from now on, whenever I add a curves, what I'm just going to do is use VFX console to save time. And the amount of time that I saved is the amount of time probably that I took to explain that. Alright, so we got our curves for tutorial purposes. Just going to make this bigger. We got a little simple piece of footage here. It's just a rock and a stream. So what we want to do real quick is just add some contrast, make things pop. So a simple way to do that is called a contrast curve or an S curve. And that is, you basically take the highlights, you bring them up a bit, you take the shadows, and you bring them down a bit. And it's a good way to create some simple contrast. Now, if you want to keep your midtones where they are, you can create a point on the midtone and just bring that right into the center there. Simple as that. And that way you're only really editing the highlights or the shadows. Now you can even, bring this down a little bit. So that's a way we can add some really simple contrast. Now let's take this a little further. On our contrast curves footage, what we can do is add a black and white. Black and white. Let's just add that on there. Now here's the thing with like stuff with high contrast, it always looks good in black and white, So if you're trying to create like a film noir look, you can really bump up the contrast when your footage is in black and white. And I think why it looks so good specifically in black and white is because when you add contrast to footage, you're also messing with the colors and their saturation, stuff like that. But black and white, you're just looking at the absolute values, and you can get away with a lot more contrast when stuff is black and white. And it just looks, film noir-y. What we can do is add another adjustment layer to add even more film noir-y look, and we can add a noise under noise and grain, and we can just add that to our adjustment layer. We can call this noise if we want. All right, so we can add some noise here, and we don't want to add too much because it can get a little overwhelming and overpowered. Like obviously if we put this at 100, that looks bad, but also, we're in black and white, so we don't want to use color noise, so we can just turn that off. And as you can see, too much noise, and it just looks bad. So let's set this to like something, I don't know, like 11% even. And there you go. In just a few minutes, you got a nice filmic looking black and white art house footage. There you go. Simple stuff. All right, so for our next example, we have this very simple footage just taken from about 200 feet in the air on top of a tower overlooking the Delaware River. Now, this shot is pretty neat, but I think the horizon is a little boring. It's just very flat, not much going on. So what we can do is take our set extension PNG here in our assets folder, and we can bring that right down on top. So here you see we have some mountains and hills, and it just looks a lot more interesting on the horizon. This is what we want. Now the problem is that the colors don't match, and we can use curves to match those colors with the original footage. First thing I want to do is we need to track this into our scene. So real quickly, we're just going to click on the color grading scene footage. We're going to go down to tracker and track motion. So we can take this point here and let's put it on this bright spot right here, which I'm pretty sure happens to be a prison. Anyway, so we have this one track point, but we also want to track the rotation. So we can click on rotation up here and we'll get another point. So let's just make that bigger and let's bring that over to this high contrast area. All right, so now what we want to do is with this on the first frame, we want to track forward. All right, that didn't take long at all. So now what we want to do is create a new null object. Then we want to go to edit target under our tracker window. And we want to make sure that that null object is selected. And then we can hit OK. And from there, we just hit apply. And it will bring up another dialog box. Apply dimensions X and Y. Yes. Now, our null object moves with our footage. All right, so now a little problem with this set extension is I did a still frame from this image and then imported it into Photoshop so I could pre-cut out the actual outline of this. And I was not on the first frame, as you can see right here. You got this little gap right here. I believe I was on either the 9th or 10th frame. So we're going to go to the 10th frame before we do anything else. And then we're going to take our set extension. We're going to take this little pick whip thingy. We're going to pick whip it to the null object. So now our background or our set extension moves with our footage. Now that's the first step to integrating your set extensions. But now we need to solve this problem of the colors and the values are not matching. So let's add a curves to our set extension. All right. And on top of everything, let's add a new adjustment layer. And let's add a another black and white to that. All right, so what we're doing now is, since we're matching the values and the color, to make it a lot easier, we're actually separating the values from the actual colors. So right here, we're just getting the pure value. So we actually did an episode covering this whole process in a lot more detail if you want to check that out. But right now, all we're going to do is focus on these values. So let's get our curves, make that big. And first thing I want to do, it's obviously way too bright. So let's bring this down just a bit. Maybe there. Already we're starting to match a lot better. Let's bring maybe our shadows down just a little bit. Now, one thing to note, just in general, the further away something is, the more it's going to be obscured by atmosphere, the brighter it actually will be. But even still, it was way too bright. I think that's pretty close so far. Now, as you can see, some of the coloring's not really matching. What we can do, we can actually get rid of this black and white layer. Let's create a new solid and let's make it red, just pure red. All right. Now we can duplicate this. Let's duplicate it. Let's set the bottom one's blending mode to hue and let's set the top one to luminosity. And we can also create a new adjustment layer and let's add a hue saturation and turn up the saturation. Now what we have here is pure saturation value, with gray being the least saturated and the red being most saturated. Now, as you can see, our background is very saturated compared to the rest of the footage. This is a very bright red while most of this is gray. So what we can do on our set extension is add another hue saturation. And all we have to do is let's just turn down our saturation until it more closely matches the rest of the footage. Now here's another neat trick. This bottom one where it says hue, let's turn that off. Now we have the hue information. Now, as you can see, most of this is very green, while this is very blue. So let's go back into our hue and saturation, and let's maybe change this more to a greenish color. Now, obviously, if we do this, it's going to look weird. Let's turn these off. A little too much. Now, like I said, the further away stuff is, the more it's influenced by the atmosphere. There's sky is blue, so it's going to have a little bit more blue. So we do want to bring this back quite a bit. Maybe to -15. Just tone it down a little bit. Now, our footage is pretty much matching. All right, so that is the color matching aspect of it. And, you know, we don't just use the curves. Actually, we could use the curves to change the hue a little bit. So maybe we can go into the red channel, turn down the reds just a little bit, make that more cyanish. Maybe go down, turn down the blues just a little bit. And that matches as well too. So we can use the curves instead of using this master hue. Now, what we can do is just get rid of all these, our color corrections. So let's start our next example, which is the color grading. Now, last week I covered color correction, which I said it's basically the very technical way of making sure that your white values are white and your black values are black and your midtones are midtones and all your colors are correct. Whereas color grading is more the artistic side of it. Color grading allows a lot of artistic interpretation, if you will. So yes, a lot of people mix color grading and color correction, and they are two very different things. All right, so let's create a new adjustment layer. We'll call this CG for color grading, and we're going to add our curves. Now I'm just going to do this really quickly while maybe pointing out a few things that I'm looking for while doing this, but it's a pretty simple process, and like I said, it's artistic interpretation. However you want your footage to look at the end, whatever feel you're going for, it's going to vary quite drastically. All right, so what I want to do is actually bring up our black values, and I want to bring down the shadows just a bit, maybe bring them back more towards where they used to be. And maybe let's take our whites, maybe bring them down, maybe bring up the brights a little bit, maybe bring up the midtones. All right, so what I want to do is start the actual color grading part of it. So let's go to our blue channel first. Now let's take our shadows or our black values and turn them up. And then take our white values, turn them down. When you turn that down, it actually turns yellow. The opposite of blue is yellow. So let's bring that down to here. Maybe bring up the shadows just a little bit in the blue. Maybe bring down the highlights. All right, so we can take our red channel and let's bring the blacks over to create more of a cyan look. And then maybe create a point here to bring the midtones back up, and maybe to keep the midtones and highlights and whites pretty much the same. So here we have our color grading. Now, usually when I do this, I realize that I went a little too much on it. So what I usually do is get it to the point where I think I want it, and then take a break. Take your eyes off of it. Come back 5-10 minutes later with fresh eyes. See, what happens when you work on a piece of footage for too long, your eyes kind of get fatigued and they kind of get used to what it's looking like. And sometimes your brain goes like, well, it needs more of this then, when really it doesn't. So anyway, long story short, we can click on our CG here, hit T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity, and let's just bring that down, maybe to like, I don't know. I mean, I didn't go too overboard with it this time around, but maybe like 50%. So that way we just have that kind of subtle color grading. Like it's there, but it's not going to pull you away from the experience of being inside of your footage. You don't want your color grading to distract your viewers. So, subtlety is always the best practice. All right, so we have our color grading. Now, we have another example of what we can use curves for. Let's create a new adjustment layer. Let's call this Vignette. So let's add our curves. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our white values, bring them down to about here, and then bring the midtones down like that, like so. So then what we can do is go up here to our rectangle tool, hold that down, and go to our ellipse tool, and then we can just double click on our ellipse tool. So now what we've done is created a brand new mask on our layer that encompasses the whole composition, and it's in an ellipse shape. But the thing is, we don't want the inside to be dark, we want the outside to be dark. So where it says add under this mask, we can set that to subtract. Very simple. Then we just hit F on the keyboard to bring up the mask feather, and we're just gonna bump that up a whole bunch. Maybe a little less than that, come on. About 400 or so. Now let's hit Shift Command H so we can hide our overlays. And you see that we have a nice little vignette. But that is basically it for the vignetting. It's just a simple couple steps and you're done. All right, and that does it for our part 2 of the many uses of Curves effect. Next week, we will be doing the many uses of the CC radial blur. And that's got some really cool uses. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.